This is lecture 123B, Building Socialism, Part 2. And this is, of course, these lectures are in support of forthcoming Volume 7 on Communism in Europe in the ABCs of Communism series, which in this case is going to be Bolshevism 2019. So, our topic to begin with is War Communism. V.I. Lenin had posed the question as to whether socialist or bourgeois power would prevail within the Soviet Republic in his book, Can the Bolsheviks Retain State Power? Eventually, the party would have to confront and resolve the agricultural situation in its way, or give way to a bourgeoisified, semi-feudal agrarian regime antithetical to its socialist goals. If that were to happen, Russia and its confederated republics might look something like an H.G. Wells' futuristic welfare state. But this was not what the Bolshevik leaders wanted, even if some were willing to live with it indefinitely, and it was certainly not what Stalin and his closest comrades wanted. The 1917 redistribution of land had been largely spontaneous. Farmers had seized the landed estates of the feudal lords and the privately owned capitalist farms of the city magnates, and although the Bolsheviks had advocated land to the farmers unconditionally, what that meant now in practice in 1917 in the October Socialist Republic depended upon who was talking. Socialist revolutionary, that is SR, party leaders, by far the largest of the farmer parties, knew what they thought that meant, and according to them there would be a return to the village collective with everyone assured of equal access to good land and a large portion of it set aside for the collective goods. SR's left and right divided along the lines of who was the most egalitarian. Left SRs tended to side with the Bolsheviks more often than with their own party members. The Bolsheviks wanted collective farms and cooperatives with all the land, the property of the nation, leased to these new entities. The Mensheviks would have been happy with a simple, free market second economy in the countryside, leading wherever it was to lead, and outside the Soviet government and left milieu, the cadets had wanted compensation for the seized landowners and perhaps restoration wherever possible. The debate ended as the Bolsheviks suppressed internal counter-revolution simultaneously with the 1918-1919 defeat of the main white forces and foreign invaders. By January 1920, what were left were the farming masses with whatever land in their hands they had been able to grab for themselves. And a central government in Moscow willing to accept that as long as the farming families surrendered grain, meat, poultry, and other goods and services as demanded by the government. A government embattled at home and surrounded by enemies which had to feed the working class, the cities, and most especially the army. Now this policy combined with the issuing of specie, that is IOUs, was what the Bolsheviks had come to call war communism. The New Economic Policy, or NEP. Lenin's spring 1921 repeal of war communism and the reintroduction, again, of capitalist market economics in the countryside had worked all right. At least it had not empowered the enemies of socialism in any dramatic way. That was because yet there was no new, wealthy, dominating rich farmer class. It would take several years for well-to-do strata farmers to separate from middle and lower strata farmers, and of course from landless agricultural workers, the latter being those who had lost out altogether in the free-for-all grab-bag affair that had been redistribution in 1917. The government, for all its desire to help, had been pitifully unable to do so. The countryside had rebuilt according to its own history and tradition and at-hand possibilities. Of course, human, animal-pulled, wooden plow-prepared fields did not require great technological input anyway. Inside Snapshot, August 1926, Richard Sorga read in, and the Mechanization of Agriculture. Speaking are Stalin and Sorga. Richard, I want to show you something. Thank you, Comrade Stalin. We are stepping up production of our own tractors from our own tractor factories. Now, that's wonderful. Yes, it is. You see here we are getting an entire Ford tractor assembly line as well as the subcontracting sources. Again, building our own factories to support it. Yes, sir. With this one plant alone, we will be able to produce about 600 tractors a month to begin with, and more as time proceeds. That will double our tractor production per month by the time it's fully online. Yes, sir. Do you know how many we need? I have no idea, sir. We need 20,000 tractors a year for 5 years. This is the minimum we need to support our needs on the American scale. We have the working people to put into these factories. When we adopt the American system that allows a multitude of jobs to be created along a broad spectrum of tasks to be performed in production, we will need 40,000 tractors a year to supply the entire countryside when it is collectivized. This would just barely keep us up to where we need to be in agriculture. So even that is not going to be enough. The truth is, I need 100 times that much. I see, but the countryside is barely collectivized. That's about to change. Anyway, do you know what this particular factory costs us? No, sir. Again, I have no idea. I paid $10,100,000 for this first factory, plus an ongoing contract for that much every year ad infinitum, and probably more, paid in cash. The capitalist banks won't advance sufficient credit to buy more. So to produce 100,000 tractors annually, we would have to import or build 20 big factories like this one and pay in cash? Exactly. You're quick, Richard. That's why I spend so much time with you. Of course, it's enjoyable for me to socialize with a person more of my type in terms of life experience, especially someone of your real-world experience who understands what I'm talking about first time around. Do you know what our foreign reserves look like? No, sir. Good. You shouldn't know. The truth is, we have less than 100 million US dollars in our banks today. All of it is committed. Where am I going to get $200 million for Ford? Jesus Christ, I don't know. Exactly. It's all I can do to pay for this one factory right now. We cannot industrialize without money. We don't have the money, and furthermore, we won't be getting it from the blood-sucking international bankers. As you may have read, the British banks have just notified us they are canceling our line of credit, and they're calling in their existing loans, meaning I have to pay them off now in cash. This despite the fact that I have maintained our payments exactly as required and have the best credit rating in the world among capitalist bankers, accepting only the USA government's credit rating. So what do we do? Exactly. What is to be done? Thank you for informing me, sir, but what is it that I may be able to do to help? I know what has to be done. Don't worry about that. What I want from you is simply your understanding of our current crisis and the importance of you doing exactly as I tell you to do. In other words, that my instructions are performed exactly as I say in the coming years. You do your part, and I'll do mine. You can count on me, sir. I am your man unto death do us part. Thank you. That's all for today, Richard. Assignment Europe, December 1926. The boss was speaking to the graduating interns from the Comintern's Intelligence Division, a division of the Cheka, at year's end, 1926. He was winding up what had been a lengthy question and answer period. Quote, "It's time for each of you to gain some essential international field experience with our parties. Yes, our parties. As you have surmised, the difficulties we have had in the Soviet Union are reflected directly in the thinking of our foreign comrades. This is not a good thing. They should be worrying about developing strategies for seizing state power in their own countries, not worrying about what we are doing here to combat our terrible economic backwardness. They have the industry we need, and the best contribution they can make is to get that industry into our collective hands via revolution at home. For a variety of reasons, this logic is not going to be universally accepted in our parties. Another, and not the least reason the foreigners are again looking to us, is to provide them with the model of what they are supposed to do. However, in practice, all our highfalutin pronouncements of October over the radio aside, our model has developed in stages and continues to do so today. They will always be playing catch-up if they insist on duplicating what we did systematically. The idea is to duplicate socialism as a system at the level comfortable for the nation involved. That will be far different in Berlin than in Ulaanbaatar. Ulaanbaatar is red flag in English, the capital of the People's Republic of Mongolia. At any rate, as I say, for a variety of reasons, these factional disputes will continue to arise in these parties, and we have to be prepared to surgically excise the troublemakers. It is, after all, the primary justification for our organizational division to exist. That is to see that the policy of the International Party is laid down and adhered to in the Leninist spirit of democratic centralism. To that end, this organizational division is now going to need help from the intelligence division. Accordingly, each of you will spend the next 2 critical years in the field in Europe, west of our frontiers, ostensibly as organizational division cadre. Some of you have already begun. This is more than a training exercise. I'm going to have to ask you young men and women to grow up a little early. You see, our country and our class are under attack. Of course, we've always been under attack since October 1917. All we have had are periods of respite when we catch our breath and get ready for the next round. Right now, the capitalists of Germany, France, Italy, Britain, the USA, and Japan, not to mention their empires and allies, are trying to reach an accord to go to world war again, this time united among themselves against us. This we must prevent at all costs. It was Comrade Lenin's doctrine of keeping the capitalist circle divided, formalized at Rapallo in the spring of 1922, which has kept us safe so far. It is the foundation for our current policies, although you should be aware the shape of those policies may shift radically. What do I mean by that? We have to prevent, by any means necessary, any bloc between Germany and the rest of Europe. Such a bloc would inevitably be directed against us, as I'm sure you know. We also have to keep the US and Japan from allying against us in the Far East, as they began to do during the Civil War. At all costs, in other words, we have to prevent capitalist unity against us and encourage worldwide anti-capitalist unity of workers and farmers. Thus, from time to time, you may be called upon to perform dangerous missions. Finally, as agents of the organizational division, you will be checking the background on each member of these foreign parties, particularly leading members. Remember, always provide a summary of that person's political involvement, if any, with the current arguments in the international communist press about ongoing developments in the Soviet Union. You will each be instructed on the day-to-day activities of organizational division agents, and we expect to see you on your first assignments in Western Europe in January of next year, which is about 2 weeks away. So we will not be seeing each other again until each of you return, and then I want to meet with each of you for debriefing. Thank you for your ideas and your time. Comrade Stalin left the podium, and the students stood at attention. The graduation was over. The Soviet military-industrial complex. Following the death of Vladimir Lenin at the end of January, that is on the 21st of January 1924, the Soviet government faced a series of crises. Not the least of these was how to prepare the country to defend itself against the imperialist encirclement. In the 17 years that followed Lenin's passing, the Red Army grew to be the best modern army in the world. It had the most sophisticated civilian support formation, including the military-industrial plant and mechanized agricultural infrastructure the world had ever seen. We will now review the phases through which the Red Army and the supporting military-industrial complex, or MIC, evolved, first in the 5 years between Lenin's passing and the beginning of Stalin's Great Turn in August of 1928, and accordingly we shall summarize the most important phases in that evolution, February 1st, 1924 through August 1st, 1928, and the budgetary issues confronting the Soviet government along the way. To begin with, Red Army Readiness. In 1924, we Reds had peace on our frontiers. However, we were well aware that, as Lenin had warned, this was a temporary situation, and we had to get ready for the next round. The Red Army itself was huge, but not modern. Yet its sheer size of 600,000 in January 1924 meant that it was ready and capable of defeating any imperialist, single aggressor, or alliance of client states, such as Poland, Romania, and Bulgaria, that year. What about succeeding years? The Army was expensive and its budgetary future bleak. Troop levels and equipment modernization would have to be modest, given the financial constraints. In 1922, the Party Central Committee determined the Soviet Republic's financial planning, or fiscal year, to run from October 1st of any year through September 30th of the next year. In 1924, that included the newly formed Soviet Union. The Party Politburo approved a government 1923-24 fiscal year defense budget of 329.2 million rubles. Of this defense budget, the Red Army got 2/3, or 248.2 million rubles, the Red Navy 30 million rubles, and the war industry 90 million rubles. This meant an additional appropriation of 20 million rubles would have to be made and the financial resources identified. And that was not enough to do more than pay, feed, clothe, and house the soldiers and sailors. Even so, it was expected to cover what pathetic war industry existed and expand it somewhat. Red Army Doctrine. Trotsky was allowed to resign in January of 1925. Stalin's close friend and longtime intimate collaborator, Red Army Chief of Staff Michael Fruntz, took over as War Commissar. Backing up his new position, he wrote an introduction entitled Front and Rear in Future War to what was to become the basic text of Red Army military doctrine. That book was entitled General Foundations of the Mobilization of Industry for the Needs of War, written by P. Karategin. Another set in concrete lie of Leon Trotsky was that Stalin assassinated Fruntz to put Voroshilov in charge. Trotsky's friendly biographer Isaac Deutscher calls these writers vulgar Trotskyists. They repeat this lie even to this day, although there's not a shred of proof that such a thing happened or even that it could have happened. This lie flies in the face of all historical evidence about Stalin and Fruntz as close collaborators and friends. Fruntz was not only an intellectual Marxist and a revolutionary man of action, he was also quite competent as a theoretician. In science, the word theory does not mean hypotheses. In science, the word theory means the highest explanatory construct in that science. We call it the general theory of that science. A subset of the subject matter of that science we call specific theory. In this case, Fruntz was able to take our general theory, the theory of historical materialism, and create a Marxist and Leninist specific theory of war, including how to prepare for war and then how to conduct it. Thus the title of his introduction, Front and Rear in Future War. Fruntz's principal point, and that of Karategin's textbook, General Foundations, for which he wrote the Front and Rear introduction, was that the proletariat state was a new kind of state. The Bolshevik state served the proletariat, standing at the head of society, and could act in a non-antagonistic way. In so doing, it ensured conformity of the mass of the civilian population. Most of the Soviet population were farmers in 1925. The farmer-worker alliance meant satisfying the needs of the proletarian state apparatus, in this case specifically the Red Army and Navy. I want you to remember that the word state in Marxist terms means the military and the police as an entity distinct from government and nation. In this political sense, the term nation includes all the human and natural resources within specific political boundaries. Government refers to the administrative apparatus that runs all those daily and long-term operations of national maintenance and expansion as directed by the party. The state and the government and the nation in applied communism, as in the Soviet Republic and later the Soviet Union, features the state, the government, and the nation under the command of the Communist Party. This is Leninism in practice, once we seize state power. This might be a good time for you to go back to the initial glossary in this handbook and restudy our definition of terms. Marxism and the National Question is the title of Stalin's first major theoretical work. This he undertook as a pupil of Lenin who oversaw the project. Stalin was living with Lenin and Krupskaya when Stalin wrote this paper. It was published in 3 parts in March, April, and May of 1913. It pursues the subject of what a nation is and how the Bolshevik Party should relate through the needs of the many nationalities in the Tsarist Empire. His presentation is a far more sophisticated discussion of the concept of nation that I've just implied in my use of the term here. In my strictly limited usage, the term nation means what is encompassed by national frontiers. Stalin's treaty on Marxism and the national question was the reason Lenin gave Stalin the portfolio of Commissar of Nationalities in October 1917. The fact that Stalin was Georgian rather than Great Russian had symbolic significance as well. You can get the entire document at Marx's Internet Archive. Fruits died on Halloween Day of 1925, that is, October 31st. And a week later, November 6, 1925, Clem Voroshilov was appointed his successor as head of the Commissariat for War, becoming the third war commissar in Soviet history. In June 1934, the party changed the War Commissariat's name to Defense Commissariat, a position he retained for 15 years until May 7, 1940, when General Temyin Timoshenko succeeded him. This change in personalities did little to affect the substance of the crises confronting the Red Army and consuming most of its high-level debate, which was literally that it had no money. Training was cheap and reorganization on paper and in the barrack square cheaper still. As such, moving units around on paper and in the field was a stopgap, a then Second World War sort of military substitute for rearming with modern weaponry. And this was all the government could do for the Red Army. At least we had the new General Foundations textbook that put forward a new fundamental military doctrine, namely that for a cash-strapped and backward economy-cursed proletarian state, the essence of the matter was to gear the Army and Navy to the civilian population and its industrial and agricultural sectors. These civilian parts of the economy should take the satisfaction of military needs as their first objective. The Kropotkin and Frunt's textbook explained this meant that there had to be 1. A core of permanent military industries, 2. The rest of the industrial infrastructures ready for immediately conversion to military production when war came, 3. And war was inevitable. It was only a matter of time and who would move first, and 4. The entire civilian population had to be prepared to be militarized when that war came. Thus, General Foundations is the first document to read as you study the formation of the People's War Strategy and the Neo-Napoleonic Battle Plan of 1941. Now for a flashback to Grigory Sokolnikov and the Finance Commissariat. On the second day of the Bolshevik Revolution, November 8th, New Style, the Sovnarkom, or Council of People's Commissars, or Council of Ministers to outsiders, chairman, that is Prime Minister V.I. Lenin, ordered the creation of the People's Commissariat of Finance. He appointed Ivan Skvortsov-Stepanov as the People's Commissar for Finance, or Narkomfin. Narkomfin had its chief commissar as the member of the Sovnarkom. Within 3 days, he was replaced. That is, Skvortsov-Stepanov was reassigned by future Cheka Chief Vyacheslav Dzerzhinsky, succeeding Felix Dzerzhinsky in 1926. Dzerzhinsky was reassigned 5 months later and replaced Isidor Gukovsky, who lasted 5 months before reassignment. Nikolai Krastinsky, who we have mentioned before, became the next Commissar of Finance. He was also a member of the Sovnarkom, or Council of Ministers. Lenin had a large cadre of extremely capable old Bolsheviks, but given the demands of the day, he had to move them around like pieces on a chessboard in order to get maximum advantage. On 26 November 1921, Grigory Sokolnikov replaced Krastinsky nearly 6 months before Lenin's first stroke. Flashback: Lenin sends Sokolnikov. Given his success with Germany in securing gold marks and cleaning up Trotsky's mess before the Treaty of Brest-Litovsk, Lenin sent Sokolnikov to clean up financial affairs. Trotsky had totally failed in his negotiations with the Germans in early 1918 and did not get what Lenin wanted. What Lenin wanted was an immediate peace with Germany regardless of the sacrifice of imperial territory required to get it. Trotsky had preferred to cater to both wings of the Bolshevik Party Politburo, the pro-war wing and the anti-war wing, and presented the Germans with a "no war, no peace" proclamation, which they would not tolerate, and accordingly the German army, the Wehrmacht, went onto the offensive immediately, and virtually unopposed, Germany seized everything they wanted anyway. Lenin then sent Gregory Sokolnikov to sign the Peace of Brest-Litovsk, now the city of Brest in Belarus, which he did on March 3, 1918, just in time. That was just before the Germans pushed into Petrograd. This treaty gave the Bolsheviks peace and secured their limited grip on state power in Russia. In exchange, Lenin gave them everything they wanted. One group of Politburo members wanted to fight a revolutionary war, taking the position that the international working class would see Lenin's peace at any price as a sellout to German autocracy. The other wing supported Lenin, saying that the most important thing was for the Bolshevik Party to retain state power. With the Germans at the gate, this was an issue very much in doubt, as Germany would undoubtedly go on the offensive again. The Reds had no army of their own at this point, and the Tsarist army had been reduced to some 300,000 men, and all of them were unwilling to continue the fight. Trotsky, in my opinion, took the position of no war, no peace to placate both wings of the Politburo, rather than alienate one of them, which might prevent him from becoming Lenin's successor down the road. At any rate, Sokolnikov had already gained experience in dealing with the ruble and the state bank, and in attempting to bring some kind of order into Soviet finances. One of the ways he had done that was to get Germany to keep shipping cash to the Leninist government in Petrograd. You cannot fight a war without pay for your soldiers and the ability to pay for food and clothing for them. All armies in the last analysis travel on their stomachs, regardless of ideology, because they are made up of men who must eat. Lenin had to have a steady flow of real gold cash, that is, gold marks, to back up the script and the new rubles the government was issuing to do these two things, that is, feed and clothe the army. Sokolnikov had had that task. The Germans knew him and listened to his plea for peace. They agreed and gave Lenin the Treaty of Brest-Litovsk. On November 26, 1921, Vladimir Lenin ordered the reorganization of the People's Commissariat for Finance and appointed Grigory Sokolnikov as Chief Commissar. In practice, this became the Central Budget Office, the National Treasury, and the Central Bank. A year later, the Rykov government ratified the appointment, making it permanent. Sokolnikov would serve as commissar in charge of the Finance Commissariat until January 16, 1926. In 1922, after Lenin's first stroke, Alexei Rykov had become the acting chair of the Sovnarkom, Council of Ministers, that is, the new prime minister. In other words, Rykov replaced Lenin as head of government, premier or prime minister, after Lenin's removal from political life by his stroke and slow recovery. The names of both the Sovnarkom and its commissars changed in 1946, when the Sovnarkom officially became the Council of Ministers, and the Finance Commissariat became the Ministry of Finance. One of Sokolnikov's first tasks was to stabilize the national currency, that is, to stabilize the ruble. Experts on Soviet history that I respect agree that Sokolnikov did a fantastic job at producing the first stable Soviet ruble and introducing permanent order into the annual fiscal authority, that is, the budget. As a former Red Army officer, he had the necessary natural sympathy for the Bolshevik Party of giving much priority to the Red Army. Fiscal responsibility. However, at the same time, Sokolnikov would never allow deficit spending or any other financial irregularities. Deficit spending then would have meant currency debasing money printing. Why? Because there was no internal domestic reserves of cash or any foreign bank loans available to back up money printing. He imposed not only stability on the currency, but fiscal discipline on the Sovnarkom. The problem confronting the government and its state in this case the Red Army and Red Navy, when Sokolnikov took over, was that there was insufficient money available to do the things which were absolutely necessary. No matter how different chiefs tried to cut up the pie, it was far too small to feed everyone. For example, the 1923 to 1924 government fiscal year featured an appropriation of only 380 million rubles, far less than the Russian Soviet had requested, which was 427 million rubles. From 1918 to 1934, the Russian Soviet was highest decision-making body of the Red Army and Red Navy, with members from both forces. The government wanted to do much more. However, there had been a general collapse in grain exports because in early 1924 there had been a world market glut of grain. In that fiscal year, 1923 to 1924, the government received nearly nothing in foreign exchange from agriculture, and it had to pour additional cash into the countryside to support purchases of necessary goods from the cities. What the cities produced had to have an internal market if the workers were to survive. The Soviet government did receive foreign exchange in that fiscal year from the sale of oil, timber, precious metals, caviar, confiscated Tsarist luxury items, and diamonds. The 1924 to 1925 budget authorization. The crisis was eased somewhat by the time of the Bolshevik Party January 1925 full Central Committee meeting because the world market for grain had improved. There had been additional sale of minerals, as well as oil and diamonds and some other metals, not to mention increased export of timber, so that the revenue stream had increased from 2.1 billion rubles to nearly 2.3 billion rubles. This additional unanticipated revenue of some 200 million rubles allowed the party to meet the urgent request of War Commissar Michael Frunze. Frunze asked for an increase of the Red Army from its all-time post-Civil War low of 562,000 men and women to 600,000 or more, and for some investment in modernization. To get this appropriation for the military in the 1924-25 fiscal year, Frunze had to have the intervention of Joseph Stalin at that January 1925 meeting, and he got it. This put an end to any more calls for a reduction in the Red Army budget or standing TONE, that stands for Tables of Organization and Equipment. The 1925 to 1926 budget authorization. The Soviet Union was able to export 2 million tons of grain, and this greatly improved the financial health of Narkomfin, or the Finance Commissariat or Treasury. Accordingly, the January 1926 Central Committee full meeting voted to increase the overall military budget for 1925 to 1926 to 600 million rubles. In January 1926, this same Bolshevik Party Central Committee meeting ordered a change in chief commissars in Narkomfin. This resulted, among other things, in the first official deficit financing in the Soviet Union. 5 million rubles was deferred for payment until the next fiscal year, that of 1927-1928. At the January 1926 full Central Committee meeting, Nikolai Bryukhanov replaced Sokolnikov as Commissar for Finance. Bryukhanov was another old Bolshevik born in Simbirsk, December 28, 1878, thus another age mate of Stalin, and an original 1903 member of the Bolshevik Party. You will recall that 1903 was when Lenin had led his majoritists, the Bolshevik faction, out of the unified RSDLP. Lenin headquartered with his Bolsheviks in Geneva, and Martov and his minorists, the Mensheviks faction, established their headquarters in Zurich. Bryukhanov had then built his career as the Bolshevik in charge of Ufa, editing the Ufa Worker beginning in 1907 and its surrounding region. Ufa was an important Tsarist industrial town located just to the west of the southern Ural Mountains and was an important center of Russian oil production. Bryukhanov was less dead set on Sokolnikov's view of absolute fiscal discipline in that he was willing to set over modest amounts of payment until a future fiscal year, as long as these amounts were small, such as 5 million rubles, he thought the economy was healthy enough to allow such modest deficit spending. Stalin backed the replacement of Sokolnikov with Bryakanov. However, the critical question of how to get the Red Army modernized to a level sufficient to defeat all of the world's capitalist armies together, or one at a few at a time, was still far from answered. To ensure this ability would require far more massive capital investment than anyone at this time was willing to consider. On October 16, 1925, the probability that such an attack would soon be organized had increased since France, the UK, Germany, Belgium, Poland, and Italy had signed what they called the Locarno Pact. It was produced by the conference of these powers at Locarno, Switzerland, 5 to 16 October 1925. The pact formalized the denial of free trade terms to the USSR. It prepared the way for an anti-Bolshevik grand alliance of aggressor nations. This Locarno Agreement was history's second anti-communist European alliance. The first came after Marx's inaugural address for the First International and the First Anti-Comintern Pact. It was superseded by Hitler's Anti-Comintern Pact of Germany and Italy in 1936 that eventually included Japan and Spain. The Rhine Treaty supplemented in the 1925 Locarno Pact as follows. Taken from the Great Soviet Encyclopedia, 1970-79, quote, "The Locarno Treaties of 1925, the initiators of the Locarno Conference pursued anti-Soviet goals. As notes from the secret sessions of the conference indicate, 3 possible variations for German participation in actions formerly under the flag of the League of Nations directed against the USSR were outlined: direct participation in war, indirect participation by allowing troops to cross German territory, and economic sanctions." Representatives of Germany, having initialed the Rhine Pact at the Locarno Conference, did not make any specific commitments to participate in anti-Soviet actions. Germany's position was dictated by its desire to preserve an independent foreign policy, and toward that end to maintain relations with the Soviet Union. These relations had begun with the Rapallo Treaty of 1922. Unquote. In 1926, a Soviet-German treaty on non-aggression and neutrality was concluded. Now, this step considerably weakened the anti-Soviet thrust of the Locarno policy. On the whole, the Locarno Conference laid the foundation for a regrouping of the imperialist powers on the European continent. And that brings us to a conclusion of Lecture 23B. And in the next one, we're going to move on to the budget authorization in Building Socialism, Part 3, from 1926 and 1927.